Okay, so this is our first PowerPoint, or one of two PowerPoints. I don't really care which order you watch them in, but this is one of two for week 11. This will get us back to the intersection of grammar, punctuation, and we'll actually then use this to combine these two categories in looking at some legal statements. So kind of bridge that nice grammar, punctuation, and law. And it should help you not only refresh the things that we learned before the midterm, but also help you do the homework for this week. So I'm going to read a letter that I took out of Lynn Truss's book. And so the words, I'm going to read two versions of this letter. The words for each have not changed, identical words. The only thing that has changed is the punctuation. So, dear Jack, I want a man who knows what love is all about. You are generous, kind, thoughtful. People who are not like you admit to being useless and inferior. You have ruined me for other men. I yearn for you. I have no feelings whatsoever when we are apart. I can be forever happy. Will you let me be yours? Jill. So usually at this time in class, I ask, what kind of letter is this? How would you characterize this letter? And most people definitely see this as a love letter, a Valentine, something like that. So remember, now when we move to the second one, nothing has changed but the punctuation. Dear Jack, I want a man who knows what love is. All about you are generous, kind, thoughtful people who are not like you. Admit to being useless and inferior. You have ruined me. For other men, I yearn. For you, I have no feelings whatsoever. When we are apart, I can be forever happy. Will you let me be? Yours, Jill. Now, all words are the same, but the tenor of this letter is very different than the first. Most people will characterize this as a breakup letter, and of course, we wouldn't want to send this letter when we meant the first, or the first when we meant this sentiment. So this is one reason punctuation is incredibly important in how it conveys to the reader what the writer has in mind. So I usually let people look at those two side by side for, the class when we're together, to look at those, so you can pause this as long as you want to kind of contemplate the differences. And then we'll look at the use of punctuation. So of course we see the power of the period here. We'll look at these sentences and see how they're different and how the writer has chosen where to end. The sentence is incredibly important in how the sentence is interpreted. I want a man who knows what love is all about. I want a man who knows what love is. So do we end it before that complement or not, or at the lexical B verb? You are generous, kind, thoughtful. Okay, nice list, nice copula sentence there. You equal generous, kind, thoughtful, versus all about you are generous, kind, thoughtful people who are not like you. So notice that now we have a different subject. All about you are what? Generous, kind, thoughtful people, versus you as being the subject are generous, kind, thoughtful. People who are not like you admit to being useless and inferior. So in the second sentence, we have qualified people with the clause who are not like you, and we'll get to what that clause is later in the PowerPoint. But see how powerful it is where you place that period. In fact, the period allows the reader about 0.2 of a second to process the sentiment that statement has made. So deciding where you want your reader to have that moment of reflection, even though it's 0.2 of a second, the brain is processing that. is very important. So instead of writing a sentence and thinking, okay, what sentence do I want next in this paragraph or in this email or in this in my prose of my narrative, now I want you to think about, where do I want my reader to contemplate the import of my statement, of my declarative sentence. And so this is really important. This is a very different way of thinking, consciously thinking about the employment of the period. And I want you to use that now, instead of just thinking of where you want to end the sentence, what you think should be in that sentence, but now thinking, what effect do I want it to have on my reader? Now, sometimes really complex sentences that have introductory clauses and embedded clauses or relative clauses in them are important, particularly in academic writing. And they're very long and they have multiple parts, and it takes a while to process and contemplate them. But sometimes we want to make sure that we don't give the reader too much information, that it's too complex to process. And even in academic papers, a nice short sentence that punctuates, that powerfully emphasizes what's been said, is really important. So yes, periods do end declarative, or what we call indicative mood sentences. But where is it that we want the reader to have that 0.2 or 0.02, 2/10 of a second thought process? Okay, so let's look at a few more uses of the period in the letter. You have ruined me for other men. Very strong statement. I yearn for you. I have no feelings whatsoever when we're apart. Very careful employment of the period. Short sentences are even okay in academic writing. A mix is a consciously orchestrated mix of sentence lengths is very important. And just some extra stuff, in academic papers, I would still caution you from using contractions. They're still not universally accepted in academic writing. Make sure that you look up words that can easily be mistaken. I make these kind of mistakes all the time, particularly when I'm tired. Apart versus a part, or effect and affect, there. All of those kind of either homophones or homographs can be quite tricky, particularly if you're writing quickly, if you're writing and you're a little tired. And so I would just, on my list of editing things, I go back and look at these when I'm working on a document for publication. I think we've talked about all of these comma rules earlier in the semester, but just because they'll be important for your homework this week, I wanted to do a quick review. We looked at lists. Of course, commas come before or come between items in a list, whatever those items are: nouns, adjectives, phrases, sentences, whatever those are. We'll look at those again. Introductions, any kind of dependent clause or phrase that comes before the independent clause that is your main statement. Extra information, which includes any kind of information that comes before or after a main point. This could be an embedded clause. This could be a relative clause like we looked at before. This could be an adverbial clause at the beginning. And if you really wanted to separate the adverbial clause at the end, you can do so with a comma. But most adverbial clauses that come at the end of a main statement are not separated by a comma. But you can do it. That is up to the writer to decide. And then we have sentences that are joined by coordinators, or what you know as conjunctions. What we call coordinated sentences employ the comma as well. So here's our commas of list. Here's an example from the letter. All about you are generous, kind, thoughtful people who are not like you. So we have that nice 3-series list: generous, kind, thoughtful. In the letter, not putting the and in there is fine. I probably would do so if I were writing this in a formal document and not a letter. So all about you are generous, comma, kind, comma, and thoughtful people. This is the notion of the Oxford comma, which we talked about before, and this idea of the importance of the Oxford comma will come up in your homework. Like I said, I mentioned earlier in the semester that lack of or wrongful employment of the Oxford comma has cost companies millions. You'll look at 2 case studies that in which this actually happened. The Oxford comma, I went to the store and bought eggs, bread, milk, macaroni, and cheese. How many items did you buy? If you employ that and as the Oxford comma, you should get 5, and you should get eggs, comma, bread, comma, milk, comma, macaroni, comma, and cheese. If you really meant macaroni and cheese to be that blue box as one item, one conceptual thing, then I would, as a writer, move that closer, earlier in my list, closer to the verb, just so I would separate that from the and that will come at the end of the list. So I would probably do something like, I went to the store and bought macaroni and cheese, comma, eggs, comma, bread, comma, and milk. And now my 2 ands are sufficiently separated and don't cause, this redundance or ding-dong effect in the reader's mind. So notice that the example that I have also listed here is a line from Robert Frost's poem. The woods are lovely, comma, dark and deep. This is not the case where Robert Frost just didn't employ the Oxford comma. This comma after lovely, notice we have a nice copula sentence. The woods as being your subject, are, your be verb, is your copula, and lovely, your adjective, that is your subject complement, referring back to woods. The woods equal lovely, but now we have this comma, and after it we have a phrase, dark and deep. No verb in there, so just 2 coordinated adjectives. But notice what's the import of that phrase. It is now working like in a positive. It's renaming lovely. It's expanding our knowledge of what he means by lovely. They're not just lovely, 1, dark, 2, deep, 3 things. They are lovely because they are dark and deep. And so this is an amplification of lovely. Notice it is adverbial. This dark and deep are adverbial, or adjectival to the adjective. I was right. Adverbial to the adjective lovely. Remember, adverbs modify adjectives, so it's doing adverbial work, and the writer has separated that by a comma. So here I have some examples, and I'll let you kind of look at those examples to see where you would put the commas. And I would work through these as far as grammatical class and roles that they're playing. So I'll let you decide how long you want to look at that, and we'll go to the comma usage. So for other men, I yearn. Notice that here again we have a preposition, an adjective, and a noun. So we have a nice prepositional phrase of 3 words separated away from the main statement, I yearn. And it signals to the reader that this is just intro material, extra material before you get to the main point. When we are apart, I am unhappy, happy, whatever it is, whatever version of the letter you're writing. We have a clause, an introductory clause. It has a verb, are. It has a subordinator, when. Notice this one, between you and me. I need another partner. Me is in object form. Between you and him, between you and her. That tells you that between is likely to be what grammatical class? I hope you said preposition. It is never between you and I, because prepositions require the noun or pronoun be in object form. It is the object of the preposition. It belongs to the preposition, needs to be an object case. So all those examples that you hear, you read, I hear them all the time on medical shows and attorney shows and stuff, where the writer will put between you and I into the dialogue of an attorney or a doctor, and I think probably they would know it was between you and me, but it tells me the writer just didn't have this lesson. In the beginning, we had a good thing going on. So notice we have in the beginning, again, we have a noun phrase, the beginning. It's got a determiner, tells me that beginning is a noun, but then it also has the short word. I can't take that noun phrase away from that word. Tells me that we're dealing with a prepositional phrase. While I will miss you, we are done. So again, I have a nice introductory clause. It has a verb. It has that nice verb phrase with a modal verb will, future tense, miss in its bare infinitive form, the lexical verb, and then it could stand alone. I will miss you. I do miss you guys. So, but when I put the subordinator in there, now it is a dependent clause, serving as an introductory clause to the main declarative, we are done. But we're not done. All right, so comma, extra or necessary. People who are not like you admit to being useless and inferior. So we have this embedded clause in there, who are not like you. No commas are around it. That tells us that that clause is necessary. If it were unnecessary, I would put commas around it. It's a relative clause, that who is serving as a relative pronoun. It's relative to the noun that comes before it, people, right? That's what relative pronouns do. They link to a noun, and they either give us extra information about that noun, or they give us restricted essential information about that noun. And in this case, it's essential, because it's not people admit to being useless and inferior. That would be all people. And so the classification is too large. So we're going to qualify that, and the qualification is absolutely necessary. People who are not like you admit to being useless. All about you are generous, kind, thoughtful people, comma, who are not like you. Same relative clause, joined to the same noun, people, but in this case the writer is telling the reader, oh, this is a relative clause. It's extra information. I want to put it in there, but it's not essential to my statement. All about you are generous, kind, thoughtful people. So we've talked about this. Remember that phrase, restricted clause or essential clause, non-restrictive clause, not needed. So we this was one of the last things we did before the exam. Now, here I've changed it a little bit. People that are not like you admit to being useless and inferior. Now we have that as our relative pronoun, linking to people rather than who. So immediately my choice of that as the relative pronoun eliminates the possibility that this is extra material. Cannot be extra material now. Essential to that by my choice of that. Likewise, all about you are generous, kind, thoughtful people that I would like to know. So here I have included a relative pronoun using that, linking it to people, telling the reader essential information. So this is your choice. This is your conscious choice of how you want to construct a relative clause. 1, what relative pronoun do you want to use? 2, is it essential or non-essential? That will help you, one, with choosing the relative pronoun, and then also will help you choose the correct punctuation. Okay, so a little bit more important information. For other men I yearn. Exclamation point tells you that this is what mood? Exclamatory. Only way that English can do this in writing. So remember, the other kind of, the first one, admit to being useless and inferior. Imperative, it's a command. Who should admit to being useless and inferior? You should. This is our imperative mood. And why is there a comma after men? We've seen this structure already. We have for other men, nice prepositional phrase, separating it from the main clause. Normally, we would, if we wanted to, we could switch this around and say, I yearn for other men. So when we take that direct object that's in the prepositional phrase and we front it, we're emphasizing it to the reader. So emphasis, and then we have the comma showing that it is intro material, but it also the moving the syntax, playing with the syntax, makes a different emphasis on the words in the stream of syntax. Of course, we've talked about this. Okay, comma splices. I still see some of these a lot in my English 300 classes. So the simple comma rule, you cannot connect two independent clauses with a comma with nothing else. It is nearly 5:30, comma. See, it's in red, not appropriate. We cannot reach the town before dark. Cannot join it this way. We can, however, use a coordinating conjunction. Remember, that's any of your fanboys. It is nearly 5:30, comma, so we cannot reach the town before dark. But we could do semicolons as well. So one of the rules of the semicolon is that the second sentence logically follows from the first. Now you will see this violated in writing, but truly, if you're going to join two independent clauses with a semicolon, then logically the second should follow from the first. Call me tomorrow, you can give me the answer then. So you can also add the semicolon and a conjunctive adverb that expresses the relationship between the two sentences, and then you would join, you would also have that comma in there. So call me tomorrow, semicolon, however, comma, don't bring up that topic again. So what's key here is that you have an independent clause and another independent clause joined together by this semicolon conjunctive adverb comma structure. If what follows the adverb, however, is not a complete sentence, is just part of the original sentence, now we just have commas around that, however. So notice that one other rule of the semicolon is that it separates lists of items that have internal commas. So in the sentence, the article contains overused, comma, uninteresting cliches. That's one of the items in the series. Semicolon, faulty, poorly analyzed data, semicolon, and grammatical errors. Notice that the reason that the main items have semicolons in between them is because they also are qualified by adjectives, and those adjectives have internal commas. So if we just use commas, overused, comma, uninteresting, cliches, comma, faulty, comma, poorly analyzed data, comma, and grammatical errors, it would be difficult for the reader to separate the main items in the series. The semicolon steps in and makes that clarification for the reader. The next list is just, or slide is now just a list of common conjunctive adverbs. It's not exhaustive. There are plenty others. There are even phrases that work in this same way, but I've included several here. And again, remind you of that punctuation structure. So main clause, semicolon, conjunctive adverb, comma, main clause. That main clause has to be, both main clauses have to be independent clauses. They have to be able to stand on their own. We could put a period after each of them, and they could stand on their own. So make sure when you use this structure in your writing for this class or for other classes that you ensure that both clauses could stand on their own, that they're independent clauses. The colon, we're almost done, colon. Main colon, the main function of the colon is to alert the reader that an explanation is to follow. So I know many of you have used colons. You've talked about made some claim about a work of literature, a point in a poem, and then you want to use a quotation from that prose or from that poem to further explain and support what you've just said. And so that's why you use the colon and then you put the quotation in. Or even when you're using quotations from critics or other research articles or other data sources, you want to set that quote up by making a claim, saying what it is that you think this piece of evidence does. Then you put your colon, and then the explanation to follow that quoted material, that paraphrased material. You never just want to plop a quotation from any source into a paragraph. You don't even really want to plop that in there and then try to explain it after the fact. Remember, once you plop that quotation in there, the reader can do anything the reader wants to in interpreting what that quotation, that data, that paraphrase means. So you want to always follow this structure of, let me make a claim about what's going on in the poem, what's going on in the story, what's going on in the data, and now let me give you the evidence for that. Colon, here's the evidence, the quotation, the line from the poem, the quote from an article or critic. So keep that in mind when you use the colon. Another thing to keep in mind is that it can only go where a period would go. This too is violated so often that it's crazy. But when you want to use a colon, make sure that it comes at the end of an independent clause that could stand on its own. So the example I have here, we have identified the following symptoms as part of the diagnosis, colon. That colon could easily be replaced by a period, just a period, as a statement. You cannot say we have identified the symptoms are, colon, because the symptoms are cannot stand on its own. It's not an independent clause. So notice I have a claim. We have identified the following symptoms as part of the diagnosis, colon. Explanation is to follow. I'm going to tell you what those symptoms are. A red rash, comma, fever, comma, and cravings for horseradish. So we have our nice series, comma series, but that colon is introducing my explanation, but I have set my statement up so that the reader is now prepared to accept my explanation. So one last little note of information, because it's in the letter that I started with. I can be forever happy. Now we have this M dash. Will you let me be yours? This is called an M dash. It's when you put two hyphens together and your word processor joins them into one longer mark. And what this does, it instead of separating stuff off as being extra material or non-essential, it is like a neon light that says what comes after the M dash is really important. And sometimes if your sentence continues and you've got some material in between it set off by the M dash, you put an M dash at the start of that material and an em dash at the end of that material, and then your sentence goes on. Use these sparingly, but keep in mind that this does the opposite of commas. This says neon light flashing, very, very important information. I want you to see, to contemplate, to consider. That's why we use them very sparingly. Sometimes you will see it linked with no spaces between the mark, and sometimes it's spaces between it, like I have here. I think this is just personal preference. I don't think it really imports any meaning either way. But you do use this, but use it sparingly. There's a guide there. I'll post this, the non-narrated version, so you can go to I think there's just a couple links in this one. Okay, homework. Listen to Malcolm Gladwell's podcast. Okay, really interesting podcast, a little bit long. But again, I'm going to emphasize that everything that we're doing in the weeks will contribute into the final exam. And then I have posted in the homework folder a handout with some sentences that are the use of punctuation in the Constitution, and then also in a couple business cases, court cases that led to verdicts. And so if you'll answer those questions about the punctuation, you'll see I've got the data, and then I've asked you some questions about those. You can upload that. You still have a week to do it, so not due until week 12 before class. And then next week, we're going to look at forensic linguistics, where punctuation, grammar, all kinds of things play into court cases. So I'm going to close this PowerPoint out. And then the second one for this week, I'm going to introduce you to one way that linguistics has contributed to the legal system using the case of African American English.